The United Kingdom has made history by becoming the first and only country to formally leave the European Union. The two sides did manage to come up with a last-minute trade agreement to prevent a possibly harmful no-deal departure. Now, though, they must learn to live together geographically but politically independent. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised a golden age for the British people. So on to the point, we ask, Brexit, can the UK really go it alone? Well, thanks so much for joining us here on the show, where my guests are Professor Tanja Börzel from Berlin's Free University, who argues that London is left with no influence over either new regulations or the size of financial contributions. Instead of taking back control, it's taxation without representation. Also with us is Jon Worth, a British blogger based here in Germany, who argues that as the UK-EU trade deal begins to be understood, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people on both sides of the channel. And a very warm welcome too to Tom Nuttall, Berlin bureau chief of the British Economist, who says the deal reflects the British desire to reduce market access and trade links in exchange for a greater degree of sovereignty. In that limited respect, he says it can be considered a success. Thank you all three for being here today. Interesting statements there. Tanja Börzel, Professor Börzel from the Free University here in Berlin. History has been made. Britain has gone. Has Boris Johnson delivered?
I would say no, Boris Johnson has not delivered, because he promised that Britain would take back control, and I don't see that Britain has actually taken back control. It is still subject, indirectly at least, to EU regulations, because, I mean, they agreed that there can be divergence, but only as long as fair competition is guaranteed. And this is decided in the end by the EU-UK Partnership Council, so it's not decided by the British government. Secondly, Britain will continue to pay into the EU's budget, so British money, taxpayers' money, still will go to Brussels, because
less than before.
Less than before, yes, true, but still it does. And Britain has no control of how high these contributions will be. So I think, I mean, we can talk about what sovereignty means, but if it means independent decision-making, I think Britain will be very much constrained by what the EU will decide in the future.
Tom, what do you make of all that?
I half agree. I mean, I think the place to start, perhaps, partly because it animated so many of the people who backed Brexit in the first place, is actually on immigration. One of the elements that the government always boasted that it was going to take back control of was Britain's borders. Now, it is true that there will no longer be free movement of EU citizens to Britain and vice versa. It's not entirely clear what immigration regime for Britain is going to replace what we had in the past. And from an economic point of view, you might consider that Britain has shot itself in the foot. But to put it bluntly, when you're a member of the European Union, you do not have control over your borders in the sense that you are obliged under most circumstances to keep your borders open to citizens from the rest of the club. Britain no longer has to do that. On the regulatory side that Tanja was discussing, I mean, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. We'll have to see how all of these mechanisms, these councils, these joint associations work in practice, because everybody, to a certain extent, is groping in the dark here. These things have been set up from scratch. In most cases, there isn't really a model for them. What I'm going to be curious to watch is not so much the extent to which Britain now seeks to diverge from whatever particular rules it has concerns about in the single market. In most cases, I don't think that Britain will want to diverge from them. But what it seeks to do in the future, things like emerging technologies, where Britain might, some members of this or a future British government might decide that it would be in their national interest not necessarily to follow European regulations and to go it alone.
Jon, you've been nodding vigorously.
I agree with that at the pragmatic level, but for me the big question is how pragmatic is the British government in approaching what comes next? For me, this is essentially an ideological win, or even a political win, potentially, for Boris Johnson. But the practical headaches which are going to come are going to make this thing turn quite sour quite quickly for a lot of British people. Whether that's ultimately going to lead to...
In what terms? How is it going to turn sour?
Well, it's going to have a practical impact for not everyone's lives, but for millions of citizens' lives at a very practical, everyday level. Prices will increase. We know that there are already difficulties and shortages in Northern Ireland with the supply of food to Northern Irish supermarkets. We've seen German postage companies refusing to send packages to the UK at the moment due to the increasing bureaucracy. There's a bit of coronavirus in on that one as well. When British try to go on holiday and they face additional complications or want to go and visit a holiday home, those kinds of issues, British small companies that simply say we can't actually export to the European Union any longer because the bureaucracy of so doing is that much more complicated. So those are the very series of complicated practical difficulties that Britain and on the European Union side, if you're exporting from the EU to the UK as well, are not solved. We don't know the answers to those sorts of practical problems so far. But politically speaking, Boris Johnson can say, at the superficial level, at least it looks like he's delivered.
Well, Boris Johnson, for his own part, says that the deal that we've just been talking about has opened a new chapter in British history, allowing the British people to take control of their own laws and their national destiny. Let's take a brief look at some of the changes that will click in over the coming weeks and months.
Vacationing in Spain will become even more complicated for Brits who crave the sun. If they want to stay there longer than 90 days, they'll need a visa. British citizens have lost the right to freedom of movement in Europe. Moreover, EU citizens who live in Britain and want to work there will now have to prove their value to the state via a point-based immigration system. This is bad news for British farmers who rely on EU workers during harvest seasons. Massive traffic jams on the nation's borders will become routine because all goods that come in and go out of the country will be checked for customs documents. It's also a blow to fishers in northern France. They can no longer fish in British waters, from which they've gotten 80% of their fish until now. A lot will change for British bankers and shareholders as well. When, where, and how much they can work will be decided in Brussels.
It's a trade deal, not a service deal.
You've got a point that you really want to make. Out with it.
No, I'm just saying, I mean, two things. First, I agree that migration is really a point where Britain can take back control. Although, to be fair, both with regard to Gibraltar and Northern Ireland, you know, the border between the EU and Britain is not at the British border. It's actually within Britain. And so, I mean, but OK, granted the point with migration, what about the services? You know, I mean, this is a trade deal. And for the EU, this is important, but for Britain, the financial service sector is much more important, and nothing was agreed here. So it will depend a lot on what's going to happen in the future with regard to a potential deal between the EU and the UK that needs to be struck, and probably will take quite a while.
Tom, reality will slowly sink in?
I mean, I think in terms of the economic impact of the country, clearly what we have done, to put it bluntly, is we have erected barriers to trade that didn't exist previously, and that means that Britain will be poorer than it otherwise would have been. It's a pretty sort of straightforward trade-off. What's going to be interesting is to see to what extent the deal that was just agreed can provide some sort of basis for building up more extensive links in the future. So you were just talking about financial services, absolutely a crucial, essential part of the British economy, which basically don't feature in the deal at all. I have no idea how that will play out, but what does seem clear is that if Britain wants more access into the single market for its very substantial financial services industry, then it will need to make concessions, and that may look something like having, ironically, a more relaxed rule on migration for EU workers. Now, that's clearly not something that's going to happen anytime soon, but over the long term, you know, I think everything is up for grabs, and we always have to remember what happened in the years leading up to Britain's original accession into what was then the European Community in the early 70s. It was Britain looking at its neighbours, looking at France, looking at West Germany and thinking, they seem to be growing richer than us. What's going on there?
Yeah, and you've just said that the UK is going to become poorer. But it wasn't part of the promise wasn't all about abstract things like sovereignty and freedom. It was a concrete promise that people were going to have better lives in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, well, poorer than it would otherwise be, not poorer than it is now, which I think is an important distinction to make. I mean, we all know that the campaign, that the Brexiteers spun the British electorate a few tall tales in the course of the campaign and beforehand. But I mean, I don't think there's any simpler way to put it than that if you put up barriers to trade, especially with what is by far your largest trading partner, then you are going to be poorer than you otherwise would have been. And sort of questions about the contribution to the EU budget are neither here nor there. Yes, Britain was a net contributor and will no longer be paying sums of that magnitude into the budget, but its firms will be exporting less. There will be fewer customers for its goods and services. Therefore, there will be less tax revenue. There will be less going to the Treasury. So there's, that's a pretty straightforward decision that was made. Sovereignty of whatever sort, regulatory, borders, whatever, legal, whatever else, in exchange for less access to the market of your biggest trading partner.
And meanwhile, Tanja, European leaders, I've written down what they said about the trade deal. Historically important milestone, major step forward. So what impact is this deal going to have on the European Union?
Brexit is often treated as an instance of disintegration. And it depends how you define disintegration. Yes, the EU for the first time lost a member, right? But at the same time, this has, in a way, and somewhat paradoxically, actually galvanized integration among the remaining 27 members in many respects. First, I think the deal, the multi-annual financial framework, plus the new generation EU, the economic recovery program that was decided, I don't think would have been possible with Britain sitting still on the table. Secondly, the EU has been, the 27 members that have been incredibly united in their position when negotiating with the UK, which was not obvious at the very beginning, particularly Germany, with its strong economic interest in Britain, was sort of seemed to be blinking. Merkel was, at the very beginning, was sort of calling for a pragmatic deal, and the Polish, because of their interest in, migrant workers, sending them to Britain. I mean, it could have well happened that the European Union, the 27, would have unraveled, and then it would have been a different deal. So already in these two respects, I think we see more rather than less Europe. So it is a historic deal in many respects, but I think it is, in the end, the impact for the EU will be positive rather than negative.
OK, we mentioned the Brexiteers. They argue that the UK has got itself a free trade deal with no tariffs, no quotas. At the same time, there's a vision of what's being called a nimble Britain, setting its own trade agenda and forging trade agreements around the world. Let's listen to what Boris Johnson has been saying about all of that, and then we'll speak to Jon, first of all.
What this deal gives us is, I would say, pretty much the best of both worlds, because you have a gigantic free trade agreement, but you also have the flexibility that people wanted and that we all care about to do things differently and better.
Jon, you were swearing and cursing. You don't, but why were you swearing and cursing?
This notion that Britain gets the best of both worlds is completely wrong. Britain has put up trade barriers towards its biggest market. And if you look at goods and services, this is clearly a deal which is more solidly in the interests of the European Union than it's in the interests of the UK. The EU has a trade surplus in goods towards the UK. The deal is good, or relatively good, in goods because there are no tariffs and there are no quotas. The UK has an export surplus in services to the EU, and the deal is extremely thin on services. So this idea that it's some kind of win-win. Boris Johnson also talks about how this is going to be, something will be different, but it'll be a reduction in bureaucracy, he said about this deal. This is also not true, because British small companies had basically a market of 28 countries they could export to, which was like their national market. Now they've just got the market of England, Wales and Scotland, not even the market of Northern Ireland that they can export to without bureaucratic hurdles. So this notion that this is somehow a win-win all round, that's Johnson being economical with the truth.
And they're going to make up for all of what you said with this notion of a nimble Britain.
Yeah, I mean, this might be an interesting point to bring in a theme that we haven't touched on yet, which is foreign and security policy. And I used to be based in Brussels, and I remember at the time, soon after the Brexit referendum, when we were all sort of trying to figure out what was going to happen, how these negotiations were going to work, the general assumption was that it was going to be a nightmare to negotiate both the withdrawal agreement and then the economic trade deal that would follow. But it was in nobody's interest. Nobody wanted any sort of great rupture on foreign security and defence policy. And this was a place, this was one area where Britain did have some very substantial cards to play, being a major foreign and security player. But actually, in the end, what happened is that you have very, very little on that at all, and that was at the request of the British. We paid a little bit less attention to that, understandably, than we have to the economic aspects of the deal. But I'm going to be very curious to see how Britain decides to use what I suppose you could call the freedom that it has procured for itself on foreign policy here. And one thing to watch is a so-called E3 grouping, Britain, France and Germany, which was crucial in negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran back in 2015. This is you talk to diplomats on all sides, and they're all interested in retaining this grouping, and not only on the Iranian file. So this is going to be one way, should it choose to do so, for Britain to retain one foot in, as it were, the European foreign policy space.
OK, but Tanja, nimble Britain, I still want to go back to it because it is important. This is the brave new world. This is the future.
Well, you know, we can talk about formal sovereignty and formal autonomy, but we live in a world in which states and people are increasingly interdependent. So the question is how much you can actually make of your formal sovereignty, right? In terms of negotiating new trade deals, the EU is the largest economic bloc in the world, and it has concluded a whole number, particularly recently, of trade deals with Japan, with South Korea, with important trading nations. China, exactly. China is, and Britain will have to do it on its own. And of course, its bargaining power, which will be much lower in comparison to the EU.
When you talk about bargaining power, I try to sort of imagine what strategy they're going to adopt and what they're sort of, in corporate terms, you would say, what is Britain's unique selling point now?
But that's exactly the point, that Britain doesn't have an answer to that. We saw just yesterday, Boris Johnson said, I'd like some ideas from British businesses about what deregulation we would like to see. But hang on, we've been trying to have this argument about Brexit for 4 years already. Like, you're wanting to basically argue for your rationale after you've already gone through with the whole thing. Now, if Britain had a clear idea of essentially to say, we're going to be a world power in biotech or a world power in artificial intelligence or in data services or whatever it might be, and could focus heavily on that or on a few small points. But that idea has not got beyond the just essentially largely slogans from the British government at the moment. So you'd need a plan, and we basically still don't have one from the British government.
And if I may add, the little plan they had was destroyed by the deal because they dreamt of becoming a kind of a tax haven, right? Financial services, no agreement. And if they believe they can become a tax haven and export their financial services to the EU, be my guest. And secondly, this whole idea of deregulating, right, in order to produce cheaper and then become more competitive is gone out of the window by the EU insisting on a level playing field.
And there's an interesting domestic component to that, which I don't think anybody really saw coming, which is that the majority that this government has, this very substantial majority, was built in part on winning seats, so-called red wall, previously held Labour seats, with a very different sort of electorate than the Conservative Party normally has. These are not voters who want to see Britain turn into a sort of, a Singapore, a tax haven, a low tax, low regulation sort of space, low welfare state. So there is potentially a very big political tension here between some of the arguments that were made from one of the sort of constituencies of the Brexit bloc a few years ago, and then the people who it was who enabled the Conservative Party to have this very substantial majority and enabled them to get rid of all of the problems that Theresa May had to deal with because she didn't have a majority. So that watching how that tension plays out in the next few years is going to be one of the interesting domestic political aspects of this, I think.
Yes.
It sometimes seems that the great British people really would like to live like the European lifestyle, but on an Anglo-Saxon tax regime. That doesn't really add up.
But if you look at that, if you look at the percentage of British GDP which is in the hands of the state, Britain is actually not at the bottom of that league table if you compare it to Estonia, for example. So there's a bit of that. But to me, it's a very interesting question is how do the British see themselves, or particularly how the English see themselves? I think we should term it that way, which is, you need to have some kind of national debate and discussion about where the strengths and weaknesses are, what the limits are of what's been done. But I don't see a country that's ready to kind of come to terms with what it's done at the moment. There's a very shrill and very emotional debate going on in the UK, and a government that's happy to keep on having that sort of shrill and emotional debate. You need to have ask some more fundamental political and economic questions.
Boris Johnson, despite all that you've just said, Boris Johnson says it won't be a bad thing for the EU to have a prosperous, dynamic, contented UK on its doorstep. The UK is going to be sort of, you know, prompting and prodding the EU to break with habits of old.
Maybe, but the difficulty is that Boris Johnson had few friends in the EU, and Britain's trust or level of trust in the EU was very low through the process of negotiating this Brexit deal. This, particularly the commitment in the so-called internal market deal to breaking international law and breaking a commitment already made. So Britain can only achieve that through practical action, i.e. what British companies, what British citizens do and how they behave. If Britain can make a success out of Brexit, that will pose a challenge to the European Union. But at the moment, it doesn't look to me, particularly politically, whether Britain is capable of turning Brexit into a success, because the British government is that incapable of setting a direction, let alone actually implementing what it says it seeks to achieve.
Sounds a bit like you want that the EU doesn't want Brexit to be a success. I would be a little bit careful, because I agree. I mean, it would be beneficial for both sides if Britain came out of Brexit, you know, strong, because we need Britain. Britain was an extremely good member. I mean, despite all the rhetoric, Britain was a sort of an exemplary member state in many respects. It has the highest compliance with the EU law, and it has played a very constructive role in the common foreign security policy, but also other policy areas. So we do have an interest in Britain prospering and cooperating with the European Union. I just want to underline that.
I think it's just a couple of sort of codas to that. I mean, we've been focusing on, as it were, the economic example that Britain might present the European Union in the years to come, to the extent that there's divergence, and that is going to be crucial, and it could pose a challenge in some respects to some parts of the European Union. But then there's the political example, and I think there's two things that I would mention. One is that you were touching on this earlier, at the moment of Brexit, and we should remember, of course, that Donald Trump was elected US president a few months afterwards, there was this feeling of absolute sort of terror in Brussels, and I think in some other capitals as well, is this whole thing, this whole system that we've constructed, is it on the verge of collapse? They were looking ahead at the time to the coming French presidential election. And one thing we learned, I think, through this whole Brexit process and how sort of awkward and clumsy it was, is that Britain has become a very good example for why you shouldn't leave the EU. It's very, very damaging. The second thing, which we'll need to watch in the months ahead, really, is whether this country that we've been calling the United Kingdom can actually survive as a United Kingdom. We have elections in Scotland in a few months' time. We have what is beginning to look like a pretty solid, substantial-ish majority in favour of independence in Scotland. Now, the British government, Boris Johnson's government, says that they will not get a referendum, so we may be headed towards some sort of political crisis between London and Edinburgh there. But then, of course, we have the issue of Northern Ireland as well. I think the one thing we can say is that the stability of the United Kingdom as a political unit looks a lot less safe than it did in the past.
Mm-hmm. We are gathered here today to talk about the question, can the UK really successfully go it alone? Just very briefly, could Scotland successfully go it alone? Could Scotland prosper on its own? Because it's a relevant question, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the ironies about Brexit, in a way, is that on the one hand, it gave the independence movement a wonderful new argument. We've been tugged out of the EU against our will. The circumstances have changed. We deserve another referendum. On the other hand, the fact of Brexit creates a massive new headache for the SNP and the separatists, in that if Scotland were to secede from Britain and then to rejoin the EU, then all of a sudden you have another border problem to deal with, just like we had to deal with Northern Ireland and Ireland. What are going to be the rules governing movement of people, of goods and services across that border? That wasn't an issue if England and Scotland were both inside the EU. It would become an issue, and that would be a very hard question for the separatists to have to answer in another independence campaign.
Presupposes that Scotland would be... that would presuppose that an independent Scotland would become a member of the European Union. I doubt don't think that's going to happen.
But it's at the heart of their proposition.
Yeah, but then the EU has to make itself honest and admit that there is. It takes one member state to vote against, and you can be sure that will be Spain. So forget about an independent Scotland in the EU.
I don't see it so negatively, because it will be an incredible geopolitical win for the EU for Britain, the country that left, to have split and to take a big part of it back in. That would be presented as a victory, and I think even Spain could be persuaded.
Great guests, great discussion. Thank you very much. I so wish we could continue. We've got so much more to say, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, then come back next time round. Bye-bye. Cheers.